The rain hit the corrugated iron roof like gravel, a relentless, deafening roar. Arjun stepped onto the platform, his boots sinking into a thick slurry of wet ash and rotted wood. He clicked his flashlight on. The beam sliced through the suffocating mist, illuminating nothing but skeletal support beams and layers of grime. He moved forward, his breath hitching in the cold air. The rhythm of his steps was swallowed by the storm. He swung the light upward, catching the face of a station clock. The hands were locked, fused at exactly midnight. 30 years of silence pressed down on the platform, heavy and absolute. He kicked a rusted crate aside. The metal screeched against the concrete, a sharp sound that died instantly in the damp air. He swept the beam across the ticket window. The glass was shattered, yet the interior counter remained strangely untouched by the deluge. He stepped closer, the water streaming off his shoulders, and focused the light on the center of the wooden surface. There was something there, bright and clean against the dark decay. Arjun reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he brushed away a layer of fine gray dust. A small white rectangle sat perfectly centered on the scarred wooden counter. He picked it up. The paper felt thick, cold, and entirely immune to the moisture of the storm outside. It was pristine. No water damage, no yellowing, no sign of the 30 years that had turned the rest of the station into ruins. He tilted the ticket into the flashlight beam. A number was stamped across the center in deep blood-red ink. 1313. He turned it over, expecting a faded date or a station name, but the back was blank. He looked back at the ticket window. The wood was rotted, crumbling at the slightest touch, yet this paper remained firm. A cold shiver crawled up his spine. He ran his thumb over the embossed edge of the ticket. It was freshly printed. The air in the station suddenly felt thinner, more pressurized. He looked at the ticket again, his brow furrowing as he tried to reconcile the impossibility of the object. This station had been dead for 3 decades. Nothing here should be this new. Arjun shoved the ticket into his pocket, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned to leave, but the ground beneath his boots gave a sharp, violent shudder. A low, guttural vibration crawled up through the concrete, rattling the debris scattered across the platform. It started as a hum, then deepened into a rhythmic, mechanical groan that seemed to bleed from the tracks themselves. He swung his flashlight toward the tunnel entrance. A thick, unnatural fog surged forward, roiling like a living thing. Then came the sound, a long, mournful whistle that cut through the thunder of the storm. It was not a mechanical signal. It was a shriek of tortured metal. Out of the white mist, a massive shape tore through the dark. A steam engine, rusted and leaking shadow, hammered onto the tracks. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and burning grease. The train did not slow down until it was inches from the platform, its iron wheels locking with a sound like a landslide. The engine shuddered, belching a final, thick plume of vapor into the air, and fell into a terrifying, expectant silence. The platform was no longer empty. The station was no longer dead. The silence of the engine was heavier than the storm. Arjun gripped his flashlight, the beam shaking as he directed it toward the nearest carriage. The doors were already open, a dark gap in the rusted side of the train. No light leaked from within. He took a step forward, his boot crunching on loose gravel, and hesitated. The air pouring out of the carriage was frigid, smelling of damp earth and stale, stagnant time. He forced himself forward, placing one foot onto the metal step. The iron groaned under his weight, a sharp, metallic protest that echoed down the length of the train. He pushed his head inside, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to reveal rows of empty, high-backed seats. He stepped fully into the carriage, his pulse thumping in his ears like a drum. He turned to look back at the platform, ready to retreat, but the motion was cut short. With a violent, jarring clang that vibrated through the floorboards, the doors slammed shut. The latch engaged with a finality that left no room for doubt. Arjun lunged forward, grabbing the handle, but it was cold, immovable, and locked tight. He was trapped. Arjun backed away from the locked doors, his breath catching in his throat. He swung his light around the carriage. The walls were covered in hundreds of framed portraits, each one fixed to the wood with rusted wire. He stepped forward, and the beam of his light caught a pair of eyes staring back from a gilded frame. He moved to the left, and the eyes in the portrait moved with him. He stopped, his heart hammering, and looked at a different face, a woman with a tight, unreadable expression. Her gaze tracked his movement across the floor, her pupils shifting to keep him in focus. He shifted his weight, and the sound of the frame rattling against the wall was sharp in the dead air. Every face in the carriage seemed to be waiting, their features twitching as if adjusting to a new light. He tried to look away, but the sensation of being hunted by the inanimate was suffocating. He turned to run toward the next carriage, but the train gave a violent lurch. The floor tilted, and the frames began to sway in unison, their subjects now turning their heads to watch him. He was no longer just a passenger. He was the center of an audience. Arjun stumbled into the nearest row, desperate to break the line of sight from the shifting frames. His hand landed on something heavy and cold resting on the velvet seat. It was a leather-bound diary, its surface scarred by decades of handling. He pulled it into the light, his fingers tracing the cracked spine. He opened it, expecting dust or yellowed history, but the pages were crisp and filled with frantic, overlapping script. He flipped past pages of names and dates until he hit the final entry. The ink was still glistening, a deep, wet black that looked as if it had been pressed to the page only seconds before. He leaned in, the flashlight beam trembling against the paper. The sentence was short, written in a hand that mirrored his own frantic energy. "The next passenger will read this." Arjun dropped the book as if it had burned him. The ink began to bleed into the paper, expanding, darkening. He scrambled backward, but the walls felt closer, the ceiling lower. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This was not a record of those who had come before. It was a set of instructions for his own end. The train surged forward, the wheels screaming against the tracks. Outside the windows, the landscape smeared into a violent, unrecognizable gray. Trees, fields, and sky shredded into a singular, dark abyss that defied all logic. Arjun pressed his back against the carriage wall, his lungs burning with the sudden, frigid drop in temperature. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and wet iron. Across from him, the empty seat began to warp. The light in the carriage dimmed, pulled toward the center of the bench like water down a drain. A shape emerged from the gloom, a silhouette that swallowed the surrounding light. It solidified into a man, but there were no eyes to meet, no mouth to speak, and no texture to the skin. The figure sat perfectly still, radiating a silence so absolute it drowned out the roar of the speeding train. Arjun gripped the armrest until his knuckles turned white. He tried to shout, but the sound died in his throat. The figure did not breathe. It did not move. It simply existed, a void in the shape of a man, waiting for Arjun to acknowledge the presence that now shared his final journey. The figure moved with a fluid, unnatural grace. It reached into the darkness of its own form and withdrew a slip of paper. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of life. It held the ticket out, fingers hovering in the air between them. Arjun hesitated, his gaze locked on the object. He reached out, his own hand shaking uncontrollably, and took the paper. The texture was cold, slick like wet stone. He turned it over, his heart stuttered. There, printed in bold, uncompromising black ink, was his own name. Arjun looked up, gasping for air, but the figure remained a blank, empty void. Before he could speak, the train groaned. The floor tilted sharply as the iron wheels locked against the rails. Sparks erupted from beneath the carriage, showering the windows in a blinding, golden spray. Arjun was thrown from his seat, slamming into the partition. The train shrieked, a high-pitched metallic wail that pierced the silence of the void. It slowed, the momentum dragging on until the carriage lurched one final time. The screeching stopped. Everything went still. They had arrived at the end of the line. The carriage doors slid open with a sharp, pneumatic hiss. Beyond the threshold lay not a platform, but a wall of thick, blinding white fog that seemed to swallow sound itself. Arjun stumbled forward, his boots scraping against loose, uneven gravel. The air was biting, devoid of the metallic scent that had filled the cabin. He turned back, gasping, his hand shaking so violently the ticket crinkled between his fingers. The train was gone. Not moving away, not pulling out of the station, it was simply dissolving into the mist. The rusted iron frame turned to gray vapor. The window shattered into fine, crystalline dust that drifted away on a wind he could not feel. Within seconds, the entire structure had ceased to exist. Arjun stood frozen, his breath hitching in his chest. He spun around, searching for a sign of the railway station, a signal light, or even the familiar debris he had kicked aside hours ago. There was nothing, just the endless, silent expanse of white. He looked down at his palm. The paper ticket was still there, the ink of his own name stark against the white surface. He was alone, anchored to a void where time had no meaning. The sun rose over the tracks, casting long, harsh shadows across the gravel where the station had once stood. Local officers combed the area, their movements methodical and slow. One of them stooped low, fingers brushing against a hard, metallic edge protruding from the rocks. He pulled a camera from the debris. Its casing cracked, but the lens miraculously intact. Back at the station house, they slotted the memory card into a reader. The screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, pulsing with an irregular, rhythmic light. It showed the interior of a moving carriage, the walls blurred by motion. Then, a figure stepped into the center of the frame. It was Arjun. His face was bloodless, his eyes wide, reflecting a terror that had long since surpassed speech. He looked directly into the lens, his expression frozen in a mask of realization. He raised a hand, fingers splayed, and waved. It was not a gesture of departure, but a warning. The camera dropped, the image jerked violently, and the frame went black. The silence in the room was absolute. Then, from somewhere deep in the night outside, a train whistle cut through the air, low and mournful, echoing until it faded into nothing.